I'm going to ask Suzanna to be next because she's going to be speaking from the USA. Suzanna Phillips is the legal advisor for Women Enable International, and her work focuses on legal advocacy with the United Nations and other international and regional forums to strengthen human rights standards on the rights of women and girls with disabilities. I think that I'm going to let Suzanna introduce herself.
Thanks, Eleanor. And thanks to the other panelists for raising some of the crucial barriers that women and girls with disabilities face, specifically as a result of both gender and disability. And Women Enabled International was actually founded because of a perceived gap in the role of international human rights organizations in addressing that intersection. As we know, disabled women and girls face specific barriers as a result of these intersecting identities. And the UN raises some valuable opportunities to try to empower disabled women to fight for the rights, to push for the rights both at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level. How many of you are familiar with the CRPD, with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? So in 2006, the UN adopted the first ever International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and this was a huge breakthrough in recognizing that people with disabilities have fundamental human rights. And it actually is very, very strong on gender as well. It took a twin-track approach to addressing gender and mainstreaming gender throughout the treaty, in recognizing that women and girls with disabilities are human and they also have human rights, and that governments have an obligation to protect these rights. And it's really a profound document that covers a wide range of issues. But international conventions aren't enough on their own. We need to, as advocates, we need to give them teeth. We need to give them meaning. And so Women Enabled works to do that in a couple of different ways. Not just around the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but a number of other human rights conventions that different governments have voluntarily committed to uphold the rights that are protected in those international treaties. So we do this by advocating with the UN to make sure that the documents, the policies and statements that come out of the UN reflect the realities that we're hearing about today, that they reflect the lived experiences of women and girls with disabilities and can be translated into actual change at the local level. And then we also work to empower local organizations to be able to use those standards and bring them home and make sure that governments are actually meeting their obligations. You know, there are 160 countries worldwide who have committed to uphold the rights that are protected in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. 90 of those countries almost have agreed to allow the committee that oversees that convention to hear individual cases, which means if somebody is not able to get justice at their local level in their home country, they can file a case with the UN and ask them to vindicate their rights and to say, you know what's happening to me is a human rights violation and this government has an obligation to respond. And so this is a really powerful tool. But you hear me throwing around terms like CRPD, we're here at CSW. There's so much jargon in the UN that it can be really, really difficult to know how to access it. And we're talking about accessibility, and I think that that's a really important theme when we're talking about just accessing the UN in general and using it as a tool to empower disabled women and girls, as a tool to really affect change. It needs to be accessible. We need to know what these things mean. We need to know how we can have access to these institutions. And that's not just physical access. It's not just the problem that so many of these rooms here are only accessible by stairs, or that there are so few sign language interpreters at the events that we're attending. We also need to have informational access. We need to understand what it means that my government has signed on to this treaty and has agreed to uphold these rights. So one of the things that Women Enabled is in the process of doing is creating an advocacy guide so that advocates working at the local level who might not have access to training or to other means of understanding how they can have access to the UN, to break it down, to say these are the different avenues that you can take to be able to access UN human rights treaty bodies, to be able to have access to UN special rapporteurs, such as the Special Rapporteur on Persons with Disability or the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and how you can really inform them so that they're getting information on the ground about how disabled women and girls are being impacted in their daily lives, and can be responsive and can develop standards and recommendations and observations to governments about how they can improve the situation of women and girls with disabilities on the ground. And so that governments can then get more specific guidance on how they can, what steps, not just how they can, but what they must do to meet their international obligations, to meet these statements that they have voluntarily undertaken to uphold, and what it really means to translate that into practice. So Women Enabled is working to try to kind of break down the UN and make it more accessible and make it something that everybody can have access to, so that it can really empower advocates and activists on the ground to be able to access the CRPD and to know what that means, to be able to access CSW, to be able to access the CEDAW committee. You know, there's so many terms of the UN and so much jargon around it, and we really want to break it down and make sure that it's something that can have meaning in people's lives. And you know, a common complaint around human rights work is that it's increasingly a tool of the elite, that you have to have elite training to be able to access these institutions. You have to be a lawyer, you have to have a certain skill set, or you have to have the resources of an international institution. And that's just not true. And it can be a really powerful venue for making sure that your government is meeting its obligations. And so that's what we're trying to do, is really try to make it as accessible as possible, so that people know what their rights are, that they know what steps that they can be taking to be able to gain access to these institutions, and that they can use it to really make a difference in their own lives. So I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can talk more if there are specific questions about some of these avenues.
Thank you, Suzanna.